All right, let me introduce our first segment today, which is Pick Your Fit. We have Amber and Akshay with us. So let me start with Amber. Amber, my first question to you in this segment is, how did you go about shortlisting your schools? What was the process like to come up with the first shortlist, and how did you refine it over a period of
By the way, hi Abhinav. Hi Anand. Yeah, it's a very interesting question because I had multiple approaches to it. I didn't honestly have a single approach. And frankly, when I started out, it was a hodgepodge of approaches. What happened is that eventually, when I started in 2018, I started doing my research and homework on this. I spoke to a lot of my friends who were at business school or who had gone to business school. Now, of course, each one of them had their own perspective. And just like everybody else, I think I decided to hop into the FT rankings and made that my Bible for everything. But what I didn't realize is that while the FT rankings, especially when you go to the website, gives you only a few columns, I made sure to download the entire thing and I zoomed through I think there were like if there are quite a few columns. I don't remember how many now. And then I started looking at factors I initially hadn't, things like international mobility, research output, ratio of faculty with PhDs, things like that. So that started changing the way I approach these schools, the way I decided to, let's say, attend these events, the questions I was asking at the events I was attending. So including, so a lot of schools, of course, do have events in India where I was. Some don't. Fortunately, in 2019 as well, by that time, when I actually was applying to schools, I was in the middle of my round one of applications. I was fairly aware of my goals and the story I had built for myself, so I knew where I was headed. And 2019 in August, I was in the US, so I was able to visit a few schools that I was keen to attend, I was keen to target. And I think that changed my perspective because when I went to a few schools, I automatically like, this is not where I see myself. Okay, this is where to be. So I think a combination of these things is what really helped make my decision. But at the end of it, it was everybody's opinion that I took, a lot of information that I had to soak in and mull over it, do my own homework, and decide on what I felt I would be a good fit at rather than, okay, just because my friend's there, it's good. Because my dad says or my mom says it, or because the research says so. So it had to be a very personal decision, and that took a lot of time and a lot of thinking.
Great. So I think some interesting insights, Amber. I think you started by saying, how you looked at the FT rankings as the start and then networking. And for the viewers out there, I think Amber made a very good point that don't take the rankings on the face of it. There is a bigger deep dive that you can do within the rankings. But, if I could take a step back and ask Akshay, and I could bring you in here, Akshay, coming to the point of ranking, how important do you think are rankings per se? Do you think that should be the guiding light for anyone who's looking to apply to foreign B schools? Or like Amber mentioned, there is more to B school hunt than just looking at rankings. What would be your take about rankings, and which is the good ranking to look at?
Right. So I think obviously rankings is a part of it. Amber rightly mentioned it's not the whole and soul. But for people usually starting out in MBA research process, it's always the first step because it usually ends up telling you, say at least in my case, I was targeting a specific geography. So I understood which colleges I'm looking at only through the rankings. So I knew that these are the 4-5 colleges that are in my eyesight, and that obviously I get only through the different metrics that I looked at through FT rankings. And as Amber mentioned, FT rankings are probably the holy grail in this respect. But I also looked at poets and quants, which ends up summarizing rankings across 4 different metrics. It just gives a better blend is another factor. But just to answer your question, I think rankings is definitely the starting point. But in I think that should be the only contribution. I think after that, it is your research on the individual schools and your depth and your fit that should dictate what school you should take.
And yeah, sorry, Amber, please go on.
No, I'm sorry. I just wanted to add something very interesting to Akshay's point of view is that like poets and quants, another resource that I really enjoyed using that was able to help me peel back the layers and understand the school better was GMAT Club, because the troves of information that you have, the treasure trove of information that you have in GMAT Club's forums that is about the school, the admission process, the alumni network was just phenomenal.
And it's a great insight that's come from both the guys. Apart from FT, there's also Poets and Quants, and there's also GMAT Club as additional resources that one must look into. And I think, as Akshay very wonderfully mentioned, that it's a great starting point when you are starting out on your journey, and maybe you want to have your first list of schools that you probably want to target. Rankings could play a very, very important role, but the most important insight here is that it's not the holy grail, as you said. It's not the only factor. There's so much more to the overall journey. So, Amber, let me come to you with the next question here. How did you eventually reach towards ESA? What were the top factors that contributed to you choosing ESA as your final destination for MBA?
So interestingly, I really wish I had ESA as my number one school on day one, because what I've seen the school has been phenomenal, and I love being a part of the community right now. But my process to get there was full of a lot of rejections, a lot of choices, hard choices in many places I had to make. And so, frankly, there was a point, and I'm going to take you a step back now as to what led me to picking ESA over the schools I applied to, the schools that I got into. Was in the beginning, as I said, right, I was a little wedded to the rankings, and that's all I went by. And when I visited these schools in the US when I was there, that really helped me eliminate where I knew for a fact I didn't want to go. But then for me, the subset of schools that I was really eager to apply to was significantly high. And I think uh, that is where personally my story, the alignment of my story as to what I wanted to ask, where I was coming from, I believe in round one, I really hadn't found the right formula for that. I probably wasn't able to build that narrative correctly for me. And so I guess what happened is in the process, I was very narrow in my approach to schools. I was just looking at like, this is the top five schools, top seven schools, top 10 schools in each geography. And this is it. Like, this is the end all be all. Moving beyond that is when I started attending the events. And my round one for me wasn't a smashing success, although I wish it were, but it wasn't. What happened is then that sobering reality check allowed me to look at schools where I've started focusing on the fit a lot more rather than just the ranking, or this is the post MBA salary, or this is probably like this is the 3-year progression of the alumni, and this is where you get, this is where you are. And that's when I started looking at schools beyond just what my myopic vision had put me to. And that's when I looked at ESA as a very, very viable option. I started I did the first session in Delhi. It was being conducted by the admissions committee member who runs India. So I remember it was an amazing event. It was very personal. It was a very close-knit number of people, that about 25 odd people, as against some schools that have a massive attendance. So, and what happened there is I was able to discuss with the admissions committee member a number of the, I don't think there were any current students, folks from the alumni network were there. And they spoke to us very personally. Like, this is the first school that I believe actually asked us to ask them. Said, what do you not like about the school? Ask us that. We want to answer it. Like, we want you guys to know the truth, rather than just singing us a beautiful song about ESA. And at some level, that just flipped the switch to me. Like, okay, this is a place that's brutally honest, that has credentials, and that's phenomenal. So starting there, that was my first research point for ESA. After that, I started networking with a number of people from the alumni network. I obviously, after that, attended a number of their online events. So there was something interesting ESA was doing that year, was because at that time in Singapore, the crisis was just brewing somewhere in December, January. They held a virtual class, which I was able to attend by the admissions committee member, and I loved it. It was phenomenal. I believe it was something on negotiations by Professor Kandar Mehta, and I loved it. Like, I just knew for a fact this is a school that has the diversity which I've been looking for all along. The class is full of about 89 odd percent international students, as against some geographies where it's a 60-40 ratio of domestic to international. And having worked internationally, I realized that this is something that I'm going to take away in you outside of just the classroom. And for me, that was it. That sealed the deal. That sealed the deal for me.
Having gone through the process of ESA, I think a lot of the points that you mentioned, I can very well relate to them. And for the viewers out there, I think I would like to emphasize what Amber said about attending these events, trying to align your fit more than anything else.
Just switching gears, and Akshay, just coming to you for the last question of this segment.
Yeah.
Now, ESA is in Barcelona, Spain, and Spain is not. It's not English is not the first language, right? It's a country that speaks Spanish. We, as non-native Spanish speakers, moving to Spain could be a daunting task, right? It's a bold move for someone to just pack up their bags and move to Spain all of a sudden. How did you make this bold decision at the end of the day? What prompted you to just finalize Spain as your geography?
Right.
And
So I think
before Akshay, you start, if I could just add on
sli-
a little bit to the question that Abhinav posted. Amber touched upon, the visa part of it. So given as Indians, I think immigration is a big concern for a lot of the Indian applicants. If you could, also briefly touch upon that in your answer when talking about the geography part of it.
Right. So I think my approach was a little different from Amber in the sense that I was very wedded to Europe as a geography right from day one. So that really helped me narrow down my schools. So, and obviously the research stated that ESA is one of the best programs in Europe, and my the conversation that I had and the research that I did and all the everything sort of fit in together that it's a school that has a great brand in Europe. And by great brand in Europe, it doesn't mean that you have to be restricted to Spain, because what holds true in Spain holds true in Amsterdam. What holds true in Amsterdam holds true in London. So, which basically, and I think research highlighted this, that the fact that the school is in Spain does not mean that your post career opportunities will be in Spain. So the language barrier there was sort of eased out in my head, where I knew that it's a place I have to be only for 2 years. And because the brand is so strong all across Europe, my mobility is going to be a lot higher. And it fits into the regions that I am interested in. Like I've always been very wedded to London as a region or Amsterdam as a region. So this sort of fit into the entire profile. And this sort of does answer the visa point also that you did mention, that because the big companies do my was and has always been consulting. So I was pretty aware that if I can end up getting into one of the top 7, top 10 consulting companies, visa sponsorship in that particular country, say Netherlands or the UK, shouldn't be a problem from that perspective. And it basically renders the whole point of Spain and language and visa out of question, purely because how global and the brand that the school has in Europe.
For the people who are watching and people who are aspiring to apply to European colleges, I think the key takeaway from Akshay's answer is that look at Europe as one consolidated geography versus looking at individual countries as pieces. Great. I think.
And just one small point, if I may add, I think just to circle back to what Amber mentioned previously in his first answer regarding FT rankings. He mentioned something called global mobility. I think it's a very underrated factor, and that is something that he highlighted and which holds true in my answer as well. Because you having access to 25 is a big deal, and I think it's an aspect that people don't usually look into very early on in their research, and it is something that should be given as much importance as numbers on FT rank. So yeah.
Superb. I think really, really insightful.